Mike sat at the kitchen table, his eyes tracing the worn edges of the morning newspaper. The suburban calm surrounded him, the soft hum of life outside blending with the quiet within the house. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary day in his home, comfortable, familiar, but beneath, an unsettling current ran through his thoughts. Mike, in his early 40s, was a hard-working man, dedicated to his marriage with Jessica. They had been together for years, and he had always believed in their bond, even if work had pulled him away more than he'd liked. Lately, though, something had shifted. Jessica, once warm and open, had grown distant, her eyes often glazed with thoughts she never shared. He tried to push the doubts away, chalking it up to the stress of her demanding job as an executive assistant. But unease gnawed at him. Jessica, in her late 30s, had become a ghost of her former self. She came home later than usual, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. There was something cold about her, a secrecy that Mike hadn't noticed until recently. Their conversations felt like they were treading water, the depth they once shared now replaced by shallow exchanges. And then, there was Kevin. Mike had met him only a few times, a charismatic, overly confident man in his early 40s, Jessica's boss. Every time Mike saw him, a nagging feeling crept in, though he had no concrete reason to dislike him. Kevin's charm always felt too smooth, too calculated. Lately, Jessica's excuses had grown thinner, her late nights more frequent. She dismissed his concerns with vague mentions of work, but Mike's suspicion was no longer a quiet whisper, it was a scream he couldn't ignore. Something wasn't right, and deep down, he feared he knew exactly what it was. It started subtly. Jessica's smile, once bright and genuine, now seemed rehearsed, like she was putting on a performance Mike wasn't invited to. She would slip out of the house in a rush, her perfume hanging in the air long after she had gone, a scent unfamiliar to Mike. At night, she stayed up late, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone, typing quickly before locking the screen whenever he entered the room. Mike's unease grew, his mind racing with scenarios he didn't want to believe. When he confronted her about the late hours and secrecy, Jessica brushed it off with a wave of her hand. "It's just work, Mike. Kevin's been pushing for more deadlines." Mike nodded, forcing a smile, but the explanation didn't sit right. Something about the way she avoided his gaze, the way her voice tightened when she mentioned Kevin, made his stomach churn. He wanted to believe her, to trust that after all these years, they were still solid. But his gut told him otherwise. The tipping point came one evening when Jessica came home late, her hair slightly tousled, her shirt a little wrinkled. When she kissed him on the cheek, he caught a whiff of the perfume, stronger this time, more noticeable. His heart sank. He tried to shake the suspicion, but it clung to him, refusing to be ignored. As Jessica disappeared into the shower, Mike found himself standing by her phone on the kitchen counter. His hands trembled as he reached for it, the device that held answers he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Mike stared at Jessica's phone, his heart racing in his chest. His fingers hovered over the screen, knowing that once he unlocked it, there would be no turning back. He hesitated for a moment, then quickly swiped up, entering the passcode he'd seen her use 1,000 times. His pulse pounded in his ears as he navigated to her messages. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, conversations with coworkers, friends, casual exchanges. But then, he saw Kevin's name, and everything inside him froze. His thumb moved before his mind could process what he was doing, opening the thread. The messages between Jessica and Kevin were far too personal. They weren't explicit, but the tone, the flirty banter, the way they spoke in half sentences like they shared a private joke, was enough. Mike's stomach twisted into knots. He read further, each message tightening the grip on his heart. "Last night was fun. Can't wait for the next time." That one sentence hit him like a punch to the gut. He slammed the phone down on the counter, breathless, his mind spinning. Every doubt, every suspicion, now confirmed in an instant. He felt a wave of nausea and fury wash over him. Jessica stepped out of the shower, a towel wrapped around her, oblivious to what Mike had just uncovered. He couldn't look at her the same anymore, couldn't unsee the betrayal written in those texts. She caught his gaze, noticing the tension in his posture, but she said nothing. Instead, she walked past him, heading to the bedroom to change, her phone left behind on the counter. Mike's hands balled into fists. He wanted to confront her right then, to demand the truth, but something held him back. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and pain, but a part of him knew that storming in wouldn't give him the answers he needed. He was no longer just suspicious. Now, he knew. And he had to decide what to do next. Mike's mind raced, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, but he couldn't let his emotions take over just yet. He needed more than messages, he needed undeniable proof. So, he played along, pretending nothing was wrong as the days passed, watching Jessica closely, observing every movement, every glance at her phone, every time she came home late. The opportunity came during a work event. Jessica had insisted he come, though Mike had no desire to attend. Still, he knew this could give him the confirmation he needed. Dressed in a suit, he played the part of the supportive husband, standing by Jessica's side, shaking hands, making small talk. But his eyes never left her and Kevin. Throughout the evening, he noticed the subtle touches, the lingering glances between Jessica and her boss. It was more than just professional, it was intimate, something that should never have been shared with anyone but him. His heart tightened as he watched them from across the room, his blood boiling. Then it happened. Jessica excused herself, telling Mike she needed to stay late for some work discussions with Kevin. His chest tightened with rage, but he kept his face neutral, nodding in fake understanding. Instead of heading home, Mike followed them discreetly to the office, parking his car in a shadowy corner across the street. He waited in the darkness, his hands gripping the steering wheel as time dragged on. Eventually, the office lights flickered on. Through the large windows, he saw Jessica and Kevin, their bodies close, their movements unmistakable. And then, the final blow, Kevin pulled her into his arms, and they kissed, deep, passionate, confirming everything Mike had feared. Anger surged through him, but he stayed silent. This was no longer suspicion or doubt, this was betrayal in its rawest form, right in front of him. But instead of confronting them, he pulled back into the shadows, seething, plotting his next move. He would make them pay, but not yet. Not like this. Mike's world unraveled that night, but he didn't explode. Instead, the anger settled into a cold, calculated resolve. He decided he wouldn't confront Jessica right away. He wanted her to feel the weight of her lies, to continue believing she had fooled him. Each day that passed, he played his part, loving husband, supportive partner, all while the storm brewed inside him. At home, things grew tenser. Jessica was still coming home late, still hiding her phone, but now Mike didn't need to guess. He knew. The weight of her betrayal hung heavy in the air, yet she remained oblivious. She noticed his increased distance, the long silences between them, but she attributed it to stress or work pressure, never suspecting he was fully aware of her affair. Mike turned to the bottle more frequently, numbing himself to the pain. The alcohol dulled the sharp edges of his anger, but it also amplified his loneliness. He couldn't talk to anyone about what he had uncovered. There was no release, no outlet for the boiling rage beneath his calm exterior. Every time Jessica smiled at him, his insides twisted with disgust. Every time she brushed past him with that familiar scent of perfume, he had to fight the urge to confront her. Jessica continued seeing Kevin, unaware that Mike had followed her to the office that night. Kevin, the man who treated their relationship like a casual fling, didn't know that Mike was watching, waiting. Mike's silence became his weapon, and with each passing day, his plan to expose them grew more detailed. But the emotional toll was unbearable. Jessica's affair tore at him, and the more he thought about it, the more his mind spiraled into darkness. He wanted justice, no, he wanted revenge. And the opportunity was coming. A work holiday party was on the horizon, and Mike saw it as the perfect stage for his revenge. He would lay everything bare, not just to Jessica, but to everyone. And when it was over, there would be no going back. The night of the holiday party arrived, and Mike was ready. He'd rehearsed this moment over and over in his mind. He could barely look at Jessica as they dressed for the event, her cheerful banter only deepening the pit of disgust inside him. She had no idea that tonight would be the night everything would come crashing down. They arrived at the venue, a lavish corporate gathering filled with executives and their spouses. Mike played his role perfectly, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, but his eyes were fixed on Jessica and Kevin. Every time they shared a glance, every moment their paths crossed, Mike's anger bubbled closer to the surface. Jessica, as if nothing were wrong, spent the evening mingling, smiling brightly. Kevin, confident and predatory, worked the room with his charm, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Then, Mike saw them. Jessica whispered something to Kevin, and they slipped away from the crowd, heading toward the offices in the back. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed them quietly, his hands clenched into fists. The time had come. He found them in one of the private offices, their bodies too close, the door barely closed behind them. Without hesitation, Mike barged in, his face flushed with fury. Jessica and Kevin sprang apart, shock and fear flashing across their faces. "What the hell is this?" Mike's voice boomed, echoing through the small room. Jessica's eyes went wide, panic setting in as she struggled for words. Kevin, ever the smooth talker, tried to defuse the situation. "Mike, this isn't what it looks like." But Mike wasn't having it. He charged forward, shoving Kevin against the wall with a force that rattled the furniture. "Don't you dare try to lie to me." The commotion drew attention. Partygoers gathered at the door, whispering, watching as the scene unfolded. Mike's rage took over, and without thinking, he threw a punch, landing squarely on Kevin's jaw. The room erupted into chaos. The room exploded with gasps and murmurs as Kevin staggered back, clutching his jaw in shock. Partygoers rushed to the door, drawn by the commotion, but no one dared step in. Jessica stood frozen, her face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Security quickly intervened, pulling Mike away before he could land another blow. His chest heaved with rage, every fiber of his being shaking with betrayal. Jessica tried to approach him, her voice trembling. "Mike, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Mike's voice was venomous, cutting through the air. "How you've been lying to me for months. How you've been sneaking around with him." He pointed at Kevin, who was wiping blood from his lip, still trying to maintain his composure. The crowd outside the office had grown, and whispers swirled through the room. Mike glanced around, seeing the shocked faces of Jessica's colleagues, her reputation crumbling right in front of them. The humiliation on her face was clear, but Mike felt no sympathy. She had made her choice, and now, she had to face the consequences. "I gave you everything," Mike spat, his voice cold. "And this is how you repay me?" Jessica's tears finally came, but they did nothing to soften Mike's heart. He stepped back, shaking his head as the security guards tried to usher him out of the room. "We're done, Jessica. Don't bother coming home." With those words, he turned and walked out, leaving Jessica standing there, her world falling apart, with no way to fix it. The cold night air hit Mike as he stepped out of the building, but it did nothing to cool the fire burning inside him. His mind was racing, but there was no turning back now. It was over. Everything that had once tied him to Jessica felt distant, like a past life that no longer mattered. Days passed in a blur. Jessica had tried calling, texting, leaving messages, begging for a chance to explain, but Mike ignored them all. He couldn't bear to hear her voice or see her face. The hurt was too raw, the betrayal too deep. Every time his phone buzzed with her name, a fresh wave of anger surged through him. He let it go to voicemail, refusing to be drawn back into the pain she had caused. He met with Steve, his divorce lawyer, who guided him through the legal process with calm professionalism. Mike felt numb as they discussed the division of assets, the steps to file the papers. Each conversation was a reminder of the life he was dismantling, piece by piece. But it was necessary, and Mike knew there was no other way forward. Jessica moved out, leaving the house that had once been their home. The silence that followed was deafening. Mike walked through the empty rooms, memories of their life together creeping in, laughter, shared dreams, moments of happiness that now felt like lies. But instead of being consumed by bitterness, he began to accept the end of it all. As the months passed, Mike focused on rebuilding. He threw himself into his work, took up new hobbies, and reconnected with old friends. Slowly, the pain dulled, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. He wasn't the same man he had been before, but maybe that was for the best. Jessica's messages became less frequent, and eventually, they stopped altogether. She had become a ghost in his past, a chapter that was finally closed. And though it had shattered him, Mike knew he was stronger now, ready to build a future on his own terms, free from the shadows of betrayal.